Record to the
Recording in progress.
Well, welcome everyone to week 5. I know it passes so quickly. Yes, this week I promised it will be the last quiz. And the next quiz, everyone will receive 3 points as a bonus. So thank you, and I appreciate your participation. And I know that actually you will be very busy reading lengthy readings for next week and getting ready for writing the commentary, which I will discuss next week. You know, I will share a couple of examples from previous years, not the very good ones and not the very bad ones, the ones that you can actually detect the strength of the writing, but also the weaknesses to avoid, hopefully. So I know they are very lengthy, but if you can actually plan to read the readings as much as you can, the discussion next week, which is very, very critical, would make more sense, right? And remember that we want to be very strategic in reading the readings. We don't want to, get stuck in trying to understand every sentence. Just the gist of each part of it. The gist of the main arguments, the key arguments. The first one talks about the old or classical alternatives to capitalism, and the second one discusses a number of the new ones. And if you look at the commentary question, the question is kind of pretty simple. To what extent, those alternatives or those readings question the myth of all myths, the mother of all myths, or the father of all myths, which is there is no alternative. That was the famous quote from Thatcher, if you may remember. She said, there is no alternative. So from next week we'll get into the business of alternatives. And the very first essential thing to do is to actually extend our critical thinking skills that we have developed so far, and we have applied that to capitalism. We would like to extend that to the alternatives as well. So we won't end up practically repeating the mistakes of the past and getting embarrassed. That's the purpose. That's the ambitious purpose. Okay, this week, as you know, the topic is related to the ecological aspects of capitalism. And as you can see, the title that I have chosen, and it has briefly explained, I think, in one of the readings, is something like this: Anthropocene or Capitalocene. Will the planet survive capitalism? Anyone has heard of Anthropocene? Okay, what does that mean? Can you?
It's sort of the label for what era the planet is in, and so we're transitioning into the Anthropocene, which is like the age of the humans and sort of the human effect on the climate change.
Yes, the human effect. Yes, that now we have entered a new era in the geological history of the planet. Supposed to work, and the impact of human activities on the planet is so significant that we can name one episode or one period of the history of the planet based on that impact. So anthropo means what? Humans, right? And scene means new. So a kind of a new era where the humans are becoming so dominant that they would affect the way that the ecosystems and everything work or may not work. But as you can see, this has been kind of, in social sciences, we have a not very easy relationship with this concept, especially when we talk about humans and we ruin the planet, and we social scientists normally say, But what do we mean by the humans? What do you mean by we? Who are we? Who are these humans? Are we equally responsible, or are we equally exposed to the consequences of our activities on the planet, the ecological problems, or not? So, and how about naming the system again? And if the system is responsible for that, and if the system is, the most dominant system is capital or capitalism, then some people will say, why not calling it Capitalism? Which I'm not really, I don't see really a kind of a contradiction between Anthropocene and Capitalism the way some may see, but that is to emphasize the impact of the system, because we are not equally responsible. And if we were, humans been around for ages, right? But we didn't have this kind of impact, or in terms of its severity. So therefore, it's better to be a little bit more cautious when we use such terms. For instance, when we talk about global warming, the concept of global may imply that the impact of climate change is being experienced equally everywhere. It's a coherent global phenomenon that is happening everywhere, and everyone everywhere is responsible for that. So that concept, like global, although helps us to understand the scope and the scale of the problems, but it can hide the inconsistencies within the phenomenon. Okay, that was a kind of lengthy footnote just to tell you why that title was chosen. Now, like the previous weeks, we have a myth to question, or ideological narrative to question, that well, capitalism is naturally nature-friendly, or capitalism is or can become ecologically sustainable if it hasn't been so far nature-friendly. And you can see that the underpinning assumptions behind this ideological narrative is that, again, we have to emphasize growth, economic growth. Economic growth will bring us more prosperity. As a prosperous society, we will be in a better condition or a status to address our ecological concern. Just look at the advanced societies, those especially who are more prosperous, they are more capable of addressing their ecological problems, versus those who are those countries that are poorer and they're not capable of addressing their problems. Well, you may immediately say, but these two things are very much interrelated. The fact that some countries are economically advanced and some countries are not economically advanced. But anyway, this kind of approach, this kind of narrative may remind you the other two myths that we have been dealing with. One was that we have to prioritize growth over inequality, and then at the end we will have the trickle down, which will save us. The second one was saying that let's prioritize growth over democracy, and then the more countries or the more we open our economies and liberalize our economies, the more we are capable of having more democracy, more political liberalization or liberation. And again, this is the case with this one. But we saw that even the proponents of neoliberalism, the proponents of that ideology, they have actually become aware. They started to doubt, that, and then they became aware and they confessed that actually we can't really prioritize growth and ignore inequality. We can't prioritize growth and ignore democracy. Both equality, social justice, and democracy are as important, and they need to be secured, they need to be looked after from the beginning. The process is as important as the end. And this is a kind of a confession coming from those people, because I don't think they are genuinely worried about democracy or genuinely worried about social justice, but they were very much worried about economic growth, because they realized that without some level of social equality, economic growth is not going to come. And the history actually showed us when we were looking after equality, we had higher rates of economic growth as well. But this story could also be a little bit different, because regardless of when we had higher rates of growth or lower rates of growth, the situation has becoming worse and worse. Global warming has been growing faster and faster, regardless. And I have a graph, if I can find enough time to present that, you will see that even the nice, lovely Scandinavian social democracy don't have a very good record in terms of their ecological footprints and so on and so forth. The only countries that have a better record in terms of their ecological footprints are the underdeveloped countries. And the reason is that they are not as industrialized as the advanced economies. So you see that this would be kind of a difference between this narrative, the reality behind the narrative, and the other two narratives. Well, the kind of a response that we're hearing from those who have started questioning this ideology is that, well, this sounds like a kind of a greenwashing, and let's stop that, and let's start thinking about something that is meaningfully different, at least in terms of its ecological impact. Now we have two readings for this week, and again I apologize, they may sound a little bit too lengthy. The first one is not academic one. The first one is written by George Monbiot. I don't know if you know him. He's a famous kind of journalist and very critical. He's been kind of one of the celebrities of the anti-globalization, or I would say global justice, because that's again a label, anti-globalization. The movement that emerged late 1990s. And there were protests against the World Trade Organization and International Monetary Fund and all those, policies behind globalization. It was labeled as anti-globalization, but the movement itself was global. My PhD thesis was about.
Like anti-free trade.
Yes, yeah. My PhD thesis was about them, and then I renamed them. Like a few other people, I call them global justice movements. But anyway, so he is kind of very well known, and he's an advocate of change, and he is very worried about climate change. So that Guardian, I think that's not too sophisticated. It gives us very interesting examples. I will discuss some of the main arguments in that, just as a summary. Hopefully that would help you understand the text better. If you haven't read that yet, and if you have read, therefore, hopefully we're going to have a bit of good discussion. The second one is written by a friend of mine, Hans. He's retired associate professor from Melbourne University, and he joined us at the symposium we had in 2018 and presented a paper, and then I invited him to contribute that paper to our handbook. So that's from the handbook, published 2020. he has the habit of writing things in simpler terms compared to other academics. So I thought that might be a good one. He's eco-socialist, and he advocates for that, and he advocates for democratic eco-socialism, and he thinks that we should actually think of establishing new political parties. He's not like some other leftists that want to turn their back to politics because politics is too dirty and so on and so forth, but he's also disappointed with the major parties, so he thinks that we should strive towards that. But that doesn't mean that we should give up our own grassroots movements.
How can you do anything if it's you politicise it? Because you stay just pretty much in that space of being a private person, a consumer. So you can't really get much done, and you can't really galvanise people by staying in that realm.
Okay. Well, we will address that hopefully. Okay. So yes, these are the two readings. Again, we need to be as strategic as possible. So if you are, pressed for time, you may just try to pick up on those main arguments. Skip things. You don't need to really highlight every sentence and try to understand every sentence. Just their main arguments that should be. And I normally discuss. Like every other week, I will discuss a set of quiz questions, so you know where exactly you can focus when you are reading these two texts. The first one from George Monbiot, and the title is "Capitalism is Killing the Planet." It's an interesting title, but as I will explain later, I don't think the content really stands. What do you think? You think that the content was very much compatible with the title? Anyone has read that? Okay, we will towards the end of the presentation of the summary, we will discuss that. So he starts with these things that the situation is so bad, but we don't see the reaction, the response that would match the crisis. And he thinks that possibly everyone is telling something like this to themselves, that if it were really so serious, someone would stop us, right? If someone is not stopping us, so maybe it's not that serious. I'm not sure. Do you agree with that? Do you think, is that why? I've been presenting this topic for almost 10 years. And I've been covering, this year is kind of exceptional. I'm not covering the data because they are horrible. They are, terrifying. They are so depressing, seriously so depressing. But every time I finish the presentation, finish the discussion, I ask myself, if that's so serious, if we're heading towards the hell, you should expect that people would be on national strike endlessly, going to the parliaments for sit-ins and not going away until something meaningful comes out of those parliaments. But we don't see that. We don't see that. And how can we really explain that? There are political scientists trying to survey people, what's going on in the minds of the people. There are political scientists and critical journalists like George Monbiot trying to show what role the media, mainstream media, plays, and how much money from the corporation is getting injected into this, and so on and so forth. If you have watched the Sky News or what is it called, Fox News or false news or whatever you may call it, but are they the only voice? And why such media are so dominant?
I know just recently.
Okay.
Very recently, others may have seen it. There's a statement from Guterres at the UN. Mm-hmm. You may have seen it on TV, where he's calling for change, and we've heard this before, but now it seems to be a much more urgent message to us people saying, look, we've got to stop or there's going to be a disaster. Did anyone else see it on TV? No.
Yeah, okay. Well, such messages should have been said many decades earlier. Anyone else wants? Okay. Oh, okay, over there. Okay. I would like to see kind of more contribution and participation from everyone, but that's okay.
I was just going to say
Yeah.
what you're saying is for why so the news media like Fox News and all that so popular is because they give you the idea that your opinion is authority and it can't be challenged if it is that other person, there's a problem with that other person. It's all that feeding of that whole breakdown trust and how authority lies in you as the opinion holder.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anyone else, please?
I thought his point that humans, our instincts not to survive but rather to obey was pretty valid, and I feel like it's held some truth in what we're seeing in society.
Okay. You want to? No? Okay. Anyone else? Yeah. I'll come back to you.
I suppose at the end of the piece it just says our survival depends on disobedience, and I think we know that if we go against what is right, we'll probably have progress, and that's how we've got to the stage that we are today. But it's become an individual problem, so we're focusing on all these small things like banning plastics and obviously the things that are mentioned in the article, that it feels like it's a very slow progress, that like the disobedience isn't like something big that can happen because these corporate players are the ones that kind of have now got the control. Like we're so low on the ranks that we can't do anything as individuals, that like even our disobedience is like it's kind of unnoticed because it's like really just something small that we're changing.
Mm-hmm.
So we haven't got any power to.
Okay. But I mean, wouldn't history tell us that it has always been like this, and there have also been big revolutions and big changes happening from? Yes, okay. You please.
So I think it also like ties in with humans not being particularly good at evaluating long-term dangers. Mm-hmm. So like you could link it to almost like like smoking. People are happy to do like damage now if it's not going to be apparent for decades, and it's really hard to judge that versus something that's a much more immediate and pressing threat.
Yeah, we can come up with different explanations. But then he continues to say that complex systems behave in kind of a very consistent way. Normally, in normal conditions, they self-regulate themselves, the ecosystems especially. But when they pass a tipping point, a sudden flip may happen and they enter a new kind of equilibrium, a new kind of situation that is very difficult to actually reverse. Like, for instance, you can consider the body as a system. And if I, for instance, myself keep eating carbohydrates and trans fats and so on and so forth, I will finally push my body beyond a point that I would get, for instance, I become diabetic, insulin resistant, and then it would be very difficult to reverse things. Then I have to go and start taking pills. Yes?
I was just thinking how, like, that point, it kind of feels like that's why people don't make the change, because it seems like the issue is so massive and that our small things can't help it, so we just we just go, oh, well, we're consigning ourselves to our fate because it's too hard to shift anymore. So
yes, and I think he also tries to explain. That's a very good point. He tries to explain that why we are paying too much attention to little things and ignoring the bigger things. And he thinks this is intentional, right? Is that what you could get from the... Yeah, okay. Anyway, so maybe I just skip this because you can read them and they're not that central. You know, the examples from the nature and how bad things are. Our great intelligence now works against us. I understand this is not an academic article, and we academics are so worried about the words and the differences that they can. I mean, when I just see us, I say, who is this us? Who is we? And this kind of concepts that great intelligence now works against us. It's like a universal declaration of something about human nature. That human nature favors obedience over survival and things like that, which I don't think that can be really backed up by sciences. Human nature is so flexible and so diverse, and we are as cooperative as greedy, we are as survival-seeking as obedient, we are as disobedient as obedient. It depends on the conditions we are and the environment, interactions, and so on and so forth. We have seen great changes in the history. We have seen also dark ages in the history. He also talks about cake to climate ratio, which sounded very funny and interesting. That we, you count the number of the times, for instance, a not very important thing like cake appears in the media versus climate. If you're interested, he has another thing on YouTube. He became involved in a kind of a discussion, a debate, and that's his part of the debate. You can watch that later if you like. And in there, he tries to explain what he means by capitalism, and I think he gives a better explanation than what he has done in that text. Okay, and he talks about the media frenetic distraction, trivialization of public life, deadly flippancy or shallowness that has actually has made it very difficult, socially impossible to talk about the important things. The news have become gossip, especially around the politics, who is in, who is at, who said what to whom, and so on and so forth. And then he comes up with this idea of surface tension, which I think it's a very interesting one. And I understand why he develops this concept, because again he is a journalist. That we are stuck on the surface, and the surface tension is the tension between what we know about the crisis and that lack of seriousness. That's the way I think I understood that. Even when we try to address the crisis. And he also comes up with this term or terminology that, micro-consumerist bollocks, which is a polite way of saying bullshit. So it's or nonsense. That we are actually very much involved in this MCB. Again, we are terrified about a seahorse, but at the same time forgetting or ignoring or neglecting the massive changes around us.
Is the voyance of the political, does that mean that it gets transferred with this consumerist behaviour? It gets transferred to that ideology behind it, that you're doing something, you're participating, that you can make a change. It gets transferred to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's a very good way of re-articulating what he says. Yes. So he doesn't deny that little things count. He says every little things count, but not for very much. So I think between little things and big things, he's not arguing that we should find a balance. He is saying that we have been paying too much attention to little things. Now we have to shift our focus to bigger things, the ones that are happening at much larger scale and their very root causes. And he thinks that this this surface tension, this ignorance, public ignorance, I would say, is kind of, it's not something happening naturally as the result of flaws in our cultures and things like that. He believes that there are and there have been deliberative efforts to stop us seeing the bigger picture, and he refers to a number of interesting historical events or campaigns, especially the ones that have been led by the corporations in the name of nature, but practically for the sake of capital, for the sake of profit, for the sake of expanding corporate power. He refers to tricks that they play. For instance, the concept of personal carbon footprint, that which came out of BP, right? British Petroleum, developed by them in order to shift the pressure and the brunt of blame or the brunt of burden to the consumers, away from the producers. And an interesting thing that he says that this kind of shift is not just a shift in our attention from the producers to the consumers, but also turning us as citizens to consumers. So did you get that point from him? Sorry, I'm blocking your view. Yes, so there's a political consequence. It's not just a kind of a distraction tactic or a strategy. It actually turns us from collective citizens to individuals. So as consumers we are powerless, but as citizens we can demand political change. So the way we see ourselves is no longer an active collective citizenship. It's a consumer. I'm a consumer, and I should be kind of very concerned about my personal behavior, my personal footprint, and regardless of how much actually the corporations have power. Now another aspect of is not very much clear in connecting or relating the problem to capitalism. Again, his definition of capitalism is not that clear to me, at least. But he refers to some aspects of capitalism that you can hardly disconnect them from the heart, from the nature of capitalism. One other aspect is, of course, economic growth being the prime goal. So universally held as a measure of government success and healthy economy. Everyone wants economic growth. And at the moment, you might have heard about the 2-3 banks going bankrupt in the United States, and then the possibility of the spread of that situation, which reminds of the global financial crisis. And there are so many debates and about what's going to happen, and the impact of that on the prices of the shares and so on and so forth, and especially for us as the workers, that we are very much dependent on super funds that are mostly being, of course, invested in shares and so on and so forth. So when such things especially happen, everybody becomes concerned, and the ecological concerns are thrown out of the window. No one now talks about the ecological concerns when you look at the news, especially the mainstream news. So he talks about capitalism a little bit. That has become taboo, and it's hard to talk about that. As soon as you talk about that, it possibly turns people off. When you ask ordinary people what they mean by capitalism, they normally say it's hard to define, or they find it hard to define, and then they refer to such things. I mean, I think we discussed that in first or second week. Their people's perception of capitalism, it's hard work, enterprise, buying and selling. But what he says that none of such things actually can explain the accumulation of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, the concentration of capital, the rise of monopolies. The great fortunes do not amass by hard work or buying and selling simply. So there must have been looting, monopoly, grabbing, inheritance, and he refers to some historical facts like the British extracting $45 trillion out of India over 200 years. Well, we may disagree or agree about the size of that, but no one can really deny colonialism and plundering the riches of the rest of the world. Okay, but he also refers to, he says it's not just geographical, but also time-wise. We have been witnessing kind of a theft from the future, natural wealth, and he refers to that as the engine or motor of economic growth. And he also refers to capitalism as a pyramid of a pyramid scheme, which again it was vague, but I tried to decode that, and I think he possibly means something like this: the benefits of economic activities are reaped by those at the top of the pyramid, and the ones below are left to deal with the ecological consequences. And then he again refers to some other issues, like for instance the carbon budget. The scientists try to calculate how much carbon we can emit to the extent that we won't pass 1.5 degree or 2 degree, and how much we have already emitted, and then the difference is the carbon budget. If you divide that by the number of the people across the world, that means that no one should emit more than 2 tons of carbon per person in the next, I would say, 8 years. But the 1% which emits 70 tons, he also mentions something about personal private jets of Bill Gates and how much he emits, and another guy, Roman Abramovich, a Russian oligarch who emits, I don't know, many thousands of tons of carbon. The other reading refers and mentions something that is relevant here, that the Australians on average are emitting 18.6 tons of carbon per person. But remember, that's an average. That doesn't mean that you and me are emitting that much. It's when you divide the total by the number by the population size. He doesn't believe in carbon tax. He questions that. You guys perhaps remember carbon tax. Anyone remembers carbon tax when Julia Gillard? Yes, and then Tony Abbott came and got rid of it. He thinks that even carbon tax is not really that progressive. It's another MCB, and that explains why, for instance, a corporation like ExxonMobil favors that. Because again, it's a bit of return. You return some of the money you have made by ruining the environment, and you should be fine. Whereas he thinks that we should go for wealth tax, and then by doing that, the wealth tax can break the spiral of the accumulation of the wealth from the bottom of the pyramid to the top. Would this remind you of something that we discussed in the past? Someone was in favor of such things? Sorry? Yes, yeah. The wealth tax by Piketty. And again, we can apply the same criticism or concern we had about that kind of solution. That is not that adequate. But George Mumby he is also activist. He also refers to things like, collective action, Green New Deal. Again, it's a reformist agenda. It hasn't been it hasn't been adopted yet widely. Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, I think he is a member of. And then he also talks about his idea that, private sufficiency, public luxury. So we should actually move towards a system that gives each one of us sufficiency, to address our needs, to meet our basic needs, and that would be sufficient for every person. But publicly, everything would be luxurious. He talks about great parks and hospitals and education system, high quality education system, which sounds like kind of socialism, right? But I guess the reason that he doesn't name that, he wants us to name the system, capitalism, but he doesn't mention the word socialism, is possibly, again, he's a journalist writing for Guardian. He wants to have a broad audience, and if it says socialism, the phobia may actually turn people against him, or anyway. So I think people like him, maybe they're kind of hesitant in mentioning what exactly the system they want is. But the next person, of course, doesn't hesitate that. He considers himself as democratic eco-socialist, and he talks about, again, in the situation we are in, things have become accelerated, the Anthropocene, Holocene, Capitalist, some people may say. The feminist would say, how about Androcene? Andro means male, scene again, the new era, and considering that most of the power and most of the wealth is in the hands of men, so why not calling that Androcene? And a person like me, a non-Westerner from the global south, will say, well, why not calling it Eurocene? Because I don't think the global south is as responsible, not yet, excluding China maybe. But I mean, these are kind of maybe kind of obsession with the names and titles and things, or terms or terminology. I'm not very much in favor of that, but each one of them stresses something that the other one doesn't stress. So maybe we can use a constellation of concepts instead of just one concept, depending on the context, the context that we discuss. So if we want to highlight the imbalance between the global north and the global south, then maybe we can use the concept of Eurocene. If we want to highlight the imbalance, the gender imbalance, then we can use the word or talk about Androcene. If we want to stress the role of capitalism, then maybe Capitalocene. But again, I think we should be kind of flexible. The rest of this slide, highlights some of the main ideas. And he talks about the capitalist treadmill of production and consumption. And again, similar to George Monbiot, he says that we have been paying too much attention to lesser entities. But when he says lesser entities, it doesn't simply mean just the personal behaviors. He even considers fossil fuel companies as the lesser entities. You know why? Despite having huge power.
Is it they're sort of like a symptom of the system rather than the system itself?
Exactly, yes. So he's very much in favor of directing our attention to the system itself and not just things that appear as the result of the system. So this overconsumption, overproduction, the astronomical size of wealth in the hands of few giant corporations and so on and so forth are the products of the system. and he thinks they are less important. Not that they are not important, but they are less important than the system. So if you don't change the system, these monopolies keep coming back. These monopolies keep growing. He talks about the three dimensions of the relationship between climate and capital, impact of capitalism on a global carbon cycle. Again, he doesn't explain that, but I think he means the pursuit of profit and economic growth has led to the development of energy-intensive industries, transportation system, for instance, and lifestyles that rely heavily on fossil fuels. Then he talks about Jevons paradox, or what's also known as rebound effect. One of the things that actually prevents us from achieving our goals, ecological goals, through technological advancement. You know, the more the technology becomes efficient, and this is known as a paradox, the more people demand for that technology, the more people consume. Even people who put the solar cells on the solar panels on the roof, they think that because they're now saving energy by switching to the renewable energy, they consume more. And about 20-25% of what they achieve is actually cancelled out by excessive consumption. So you can think of also the air cons, that they have become more efficient, but people use them more often and more houses use them or buy them. So when you look at the efficiency, yes, the technology has become more and more efficient. And as the result of that, the emission intensity has dropped, especially among the advanced economies. But although the intensity has dropped as the result of higher efficiency, for instance, the overall level of consumption has been constantly growing. And that's why we don't see any drop in the level of emission. So we keep emitting constantly in an accelerated rate. And now the global south is encouraged to become as industrialized as us, following developmentalism, and we see that they want to live like us. I mean, there was a study that was showing that if every Indian, every person from the global south wants to live like an average American, we need another 3 planets. We need 4 planet Earths to supply that. So we have the argument is that we not only have to actually become more efficient and switch towards renewables, but also we need to level down. And that's what also George Monbiot said. I don't know why I forgot to put that there. But anyway, he also says that we have to level down. That's another term for degrowth or post-growth. And if for instance, the lifestyle of a Jamaican person doesn't appeal to an American average person or European average person, but then maybe a lifestyle of a person in Spain might be good enough. Or in Portugal, it might be good enough to be adopted. Anyway, and also the carbon sink it has also been destroyed. It's not just the level of emission, but also those the natural sink, the rainforest, the Amazon, that actually has the capacity of sucking the carbon back into nature. It has been damaged. Okay, and then he talks about population growth, that practically it's again another, using George Monbiot's term, another MCB, I would say, that when you look at the data, in the places where you had increase in population size, the level of emission hasn't increased that much. So better not to blame the population. Although population in total can be a problem, and and he also acknowledges that, and he actually tries to explain population growth in terms of poverty, that actually it's because of poverty that we see in some places population is growing fast. Yes, I would skip these things again. With the further advancement of the economy, emission density declines, but accumulation continues. That's I think I have already covered that. He talks about green revolution, industrialization of agriculture and its impact. He talks about massive government subsidies to fossil fuel companies. He mentions some numbers here, which are very scary. And also he talks about climate change as an inequality or justice issue. That those who suffer the most are the least responsible, and those who are benefiting from it are the most responsible. But inequality itself, it can be considered as a cause for climate change as well. We normally think, well, as the result of our system, we have both climate change and inequality. But now there are people, especially people who discuss climate justice, they believe that inequality is a cause of climate change. How do you think that we can relate inequality as a cause to climate change?
They get treated the hardest when things hit, but it has to be expected that in the north we get the blowers soften more, so they get treated harder. Like now with the trying to repair the supply chains and that after things like COVID, they're saying it's going to take quite a while for it to repair in the global south, and now we're seeing how bad it is, but it's going to be felt worse there.
Okay. Anyone else, especially how can we explain climate change in terms of inequality?
Is it possible to relate that inequality through like the core periphery system has allowed capitalism to get this problematic, which allows climate change to keep happening?
Yeah. Would you like to expand on that a little bit more? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else? In what ways inequality can cause more climate change? You want to say something? No? Okay, go ahead.
I mean, they touch on it in the article how a lot of global north countries are sort of like exporting their emissions to global south countries, and I know that they talked about like people like to point to China's high emissions, but a lot of the global north has put all of their pushed their consumerist production to China because of their cheap labor wages and low environmental regulations, and so a lot of the global north figures jump up a lot if you account for the goods that they're consuming that are produced in China.
Yes, that's one of the mechanisms. Yeah, well done, very good. I should show you kind of a secret here. Below these slides I also add things that I can't feed. So for instance, high consumption patterns of the wealthy, that, the wealthy, they consider themselves entitled to consume more, and the lack of access to clean energy. It's very expensive, actually, those new technologies for the poor. So that inequality is an obstacle, especially for the majority that cannot afford going for new technologies and address their own ecological problems. a lot of environmental degradation happens. Poor people are often forced to live in areas that are more vulnerable and so on and so forth. Limited political power. So with the inequality, we also have inequality in political power. We have discussed that in the previous two weeks, that inequality, economic inequality, is associated with political power inequality, and so on and so forth. So yes, I mean, that inequality makes it very difficult for the poor to be able to switch to a mode of production that is less harmful. So they have to rely on their cheap resources, as you said, which are, again, fossil fuel, highly subsidized by their own governments and their own cheap labor, and they have to follow the earliest stages of industrialization, which is very ecologically dirty and destructive. Okay, and he talks about the issue of gender. I think, unfortunately, one of the very serious weaknesses of the course or the way that I have structured the course, is that, unfortunately, the issue of gender and race are not very much well discussed. So I really apologize for that. But normally people, a good number of people go for these aspects when they write their essay. Especially ecofeminism is kind of very popular subject for the alternatives that people choose, and I really would like to encourage you guys to think of gender as well. And yes, he also talks about green capitalism. Again, it's kind of greenwashing under a number of titles like technology for eco-efficiency, sustainable business, ecological modernism, corporate environmentalism, corporate responsibility, you may say, carbon trading and markets, carbon offset schemes, and even dangerous geoengineering proposals. You might have come across them on YouTube or maybe watching when you are watching the TV, with those proposals that we would spread lots of particles in the atmosphere and so on and so forth, with much more serious consequences. Again, a lot of them are seeking solutions from the same system that has put us in that situation in the first place. And if you may remember, when we were talking about the difference between a crisis and a problem, a crisis is a problem that cannot be solved within the framework of the system. You have to change the system to solve the crisis. And that's why, despite all those fancy and highly celebrated gatherings and agreements, for instance, in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed, and many people became so optimistic, but even when they started to calculate that, how much we're going to achieve if everyone stays committed, and we know that Trump withdrew and then Biden came back, but anyway, if they stay committed to their pledges, we will still hit 2.7 to 3.5 degrees. And that was actually Trump's argument for withdrawing. He said it's pointless, so why should I stay in there? And I thought, wow, he said something meaningful finally. Because yeah, it was right, but still, it was something that the country is supposed to start with and then come back, review and upgrade their commitment. But this upgrade hasn't happened much, and that's why Greta says it's all blah 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 blah. But anyway, so this is the argument that he has in his book chapter, and then the social consequences of green capitalism, and then he moves on to talk about solutions, and he thinks that the real solution comes from a globally network, of globally networked social movements for climate change that are in alliance with other types of movements, like the women's rights movements, like the Black Lives Matter movements, all other sorts of progressive movements. And then he thinks that we have to take an integrated critical understanding of climate change. Climate change is not a subject for natural sciences to discuss. It has very strong social and political aspects into it. So people from humanities and social sciences should be brought on board, and it's not just a business for the economists and natural scientists, which I 100% agree. But also he says that communities should be brought on board, and it's not just, again, the job of experts, but also, the communities are the ones that are experiencing, and hopefully we will make it to play something which actually shows when the job of addressing climate change is given to communities of non-experts. They have come up with much better solutions than the ones from the experts, especially the conventional experts. And then he talks about the revolutionary upheaval. He thinks that we have to go for significant system change, but he understands that it's not going to happen overnight. And these are the principles of that eco-socialistic world system that he advocates for. But until then, he lists 14 items of what he says transitional reforms that, establishing new political parties, taxing carbon, taxing wealth, and all those reformist things. He's not against reform. He thinks that the reforms should happen, but we shouldn't see them as adequate. We should actually move towards more radical change, radical climate governance from below. There's a number of very interesting YouTubes that if you find time, it's not of course that necessary, but if you're interested especially in this subject, you find yourself some spare time, maybe you would like to watch them. This one is by Juliet Shore, and she is...
If the countries of the global north were in line to suffer the level of devastating effects being seen and predicted for the global south, we would have already had a vigorous program of decarbonization. My name is Juliet Shore. I've been studying issues of environment and climate since the 1980s. Conventional economics has failed to step up. A small group has been able to prevent humanity from effectively responding to this crisis. The concept of the carbon footprint was invented by British Petroleum. Naming consumers as the problem deflects attention from the producers. The environment is conceptualized as something that we consume, and that's a fundamental error. One of the big messages of this series is that inequality itself is a cause of the climate crisis, not merely a result. Those who have done the most to cause the problem are the most privileged. Instead of continually expanding the size of their economies, wealthy nations should think about getting rich on another dimension: time. I make these videos because economics has been part of the problem. Economics is vital right alongside the science of climate change. The science is pretty nailed down. The economics is what we have to work on now.
The interesting thing about her is that she's not only an economist, but also she's a sociologist from the United States. She's been studying the topic for quite a while. And although she doesn't mention capitalism, I think even once, but she refers to many very interesting facts and interesting ideas, and she tries to explain why we are in this situation. And towards the end, she mentions the issue of commons and considering commons as a solution, which I thought it was a very interesting one. The series that she was talking about, it's about, it's a 4-part series, about 10 to 20 minutes each one. Initially, I don't know. I mean, I have watched that a couple of times because some aspect of it didn't even make sense to me. But I mean, if you just grab the main ideas, that would be good enough if you're interested and if you have extra time. There's two other YouTube channels that I found interesting, and I watched some of their videos on climate change, which I thought that was interesting. They refer to some of the academic findings and so on and so forth. But maybe this one, because I try to make things a little bit less dry and maybe a little bit more discussion. So instead of speaking to the rest of the slides, that I think that you can read them. I try to again write them in kind of explicit way, so they would hopefully make sense. In a number of slides here for you later to read, I thought that I didn't feel satisfied with even the chapter written by Hans, because I didn't feel that he's connecting climate change clearly to the very nature of capitalism. I mean, could we have a fossil fuel free capitalism? Why not? Or this is very much embedded in the DNA of capitalism. We couldn't have and we cannot. Or it would be extremely difficult to have a fossil fuel free capitalism. Or is it possible to have a capitalism without colonialism, without global inequality, without the gap between the global south and the global north, or the gaps even within the global north are gaps growing? There you can talk about the south of the global north, the poor people in the global north, advanced societies. So I tried to make a case. I don't know how satisfactory my attempt is, but I tried to show that a lot of things that relate capitalism to climate change and ecological crisis are very much in the DNA of capitalism. And some of them overlaps with the readings, but some go beyond the readings. But again, if you're interested, if you think like me, you're not very much satisfied with the readings, again, below these you'll see extra explanations and so on and so forth. So you may have a look, but I'm not insisting that this will be part of a quiz or you would be tested and so on and so forth. If you think they are helpful, yeah, feel free. I would call them additional. But let's watch this one. Okay, we have someone with us on Zoom. I hope they can hear us well. Yeah, okay. Okay, Madeline, can you hear us? Okay. Okay, good. Okay. Yes. Okay. Do you have any comments, any questions? Could you hear the video that I played? Okay, great, great. So no questions. I guess that's what you're saying. Okay, yes. Thank you. So let's watch this one. It's about 22 minutes, and then I think we will have some time to go through the quiz questions. This one, and see how we can relate this to the readings and the discussion we had.
This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you haven't heard already, I run a podcast called The Deprogram with Hakeem and Yugatnik. We tackle all sorts of topics, from theory to current events to culture, and just generally have a good time. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, check out The Deprogram by following any of the links below. Global collapse is here. Our summers are longer, hotter, and deadlier. Floods, hurricanes, and wildfires have not only become increasingly common, but more intense. The oceans are rising, and thousands of species are going extinct. Millions of people will need to abandon the place they called home, and many have already started. We are living through the climate catastrophe, but it's not too late to act, and we already know how. Earlier this year, the UN published this report on crises and climate change. In a document with the catchy name Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction 2022, more specifically in this companion paper, the UN uses a sentence it's never used before to describe what lies ahead for humanity: total societal collapse. After considering 4 potential scenarios, the UN finds that in 3 of them, humanity will face an increase in global catastrophes, with only 1 scenario staving off the worst that climate change will produce. 1 scenario keeps us relatively safe, 3 lead us down a very dark path. In no uncertain terms, collapse, droughts, famines, poverty, disease. These will all become permanent and widespread features of human existence provided that we do not act to remain within our planetary boundaries. And this report makes it clear that without immediate, decisive efforts, the feedback loops and codependencies between our climate and our politics will plunge the world into some dark and increasingly difficult to escape times. But okay, who cares? We've heard this a million times before. Yeah, some fish and bugs are dying. Yeah, it's getting hotter. It's getting harder to grow crops some places. So what? What's the bottom line here? I think it's important to look at the situation from a more human perspective. We've been told for years that we're on track for disaster. We've been given mountains of evidence, scores of scientific reports, and scientists all around the world are united in the same effort. But what gets lost in all this is how it affects us. Normal people in our everyday lives. Like, intellectually, I know that losing pollinating insects is bad, but is it something I think about in my daily life? Not really. What's really driven the problem home for me is watching people's totally unprofessional phone footage. I can watch 100 news pieces about rising sea levels with flashy graphics showing the coastline of Florida, but it doesn't really click until I see someone showing their home being destroyed. Someone with no video training, no agenda, just a person who is watching a lifetime of memories being ruined and sharing it on the internet because they don't know what else to do. That's what collapse looks like in the 21st century. Watching countless cell phone videos of death and destruction creeping closer and closer until one day, you're the one filming. It's hearing about a climate scientist lighting himself on fire in a desperate bid to get those in power to listen. For people like me, it's going to shoot a documentary in the Marshall Islands and seeing firsthand the waves knocking on the doors of people whose families have lived there for generations. Every single one of those people will have to leave. They'll have to uproot their entire life, escape to some foreign country, and watch their homeland sink into the sea. This will affect all of us. Some sooner than others, like the inhabitants of the Marshall Islands and countless other low-lying islands and coastlines. At some point, we will watch everything we care about be reclaimed by nature, or scorched beyond repair, or swept off the map by the next record-breaking storm. Even if you think climate change is perfectly natural, despite decades of research, much of which was actively hidden from the public by fossil fuel companies, why would you just wait and let it destroy your community? If you're out for a walk and a car is bearing down on you, and you're clearly going to be run over, does it really matter whether the driver is intentionally trying to hit you or if his brakes are out? Of course not. Your response should be the same in either case. You step out of the way. So, how do we step out of the way? So far, the plan looks like this.
I often note and have talked with many of you about our shared belief that our world is increasingly more interconnected and interdependent. That is especially true when it comes to the climate crisis, which is why we will work together and continue to work together to address these issues, to tackle these challenges, and to work together as we continue to work operating from the new norms, rules, and agreements that we will convene to work together on to galvanize global action. With that, I thank you all. This is a matter of urgent priority for all of us, and I know we will work on this together.
Okay, why don't we actually look at our options? The first thing that's been proposed for years to slow or even halt the advance of climate change is the idea of green growth. From the World Bank to the Green New Deal, many governments and international organizations around the world have argued that our first priority in preventing the worst effects of climate change is to make capitalism go green. At the core of these proposals is the transition to renewable energies and the idea that, while a lot needs to change in how we produce our electricity, very little needs to fundamentally change with how our society organizes production and consumption writ large. In other words, we don't need to sacrifice growth, overproduction, overconsumption, or anything else so long as we simply make things sustainable and renewable. It's a project that plenty of banks and investment firms have latched onto as well, with the creation of environmental, social, and corporate governance, or ESG funds in the past 20 years. Portfolios of companies to invest in that, among other things, offer a green alternative to traditional investments while also delivering consistent profits to investors. The overall message of all these measures is that, so long as we make the right things profitable, we will get out of the climate change trap and come out, if not unscathed, at least safe. It's a win-win. It's growth without any of the moral hang-ups of environmental exploitation, or the pollution of production and consumption. And while it might sound great to some, green growth is a lie. We cannot keep growing our economy year after year and also rein in climate change. One of them will need to give. Here's why. First, a little bit about growth. Our economy is based on the promise of growth. Every quarter, capitalist firms must deliver more to their investors than they did last quarter. Same with national GDP. Every company everywhere, and every country too, under capitalism, has to do the same thing. Grow exponentially or start suffering the consequences. Companies that don't grow when their competitors do, die. But growth isn't magical. At the scale of an entire country's economy, for the whole thing to grow, there must necessarily be a ramp-up in production. You can't just increase consumption, which is the way we measure growth, without producing more in some way or another. So we do. We produce more. More things, more energy, more waste. More production entails more extraction, transportation, carbon emissions, trash, and so on. We take more things out of the ground, move more things around, and throw more things away. It's what makes the numbers on the graph go up. But on a planet with finite resources, this kind of system doesn't work. We can't keep pulling more from the Earth year after year and not expect there to be a point when that's no longer an option. We can either plan for it, or we will be forced to reckon with it at the worst possible time. And then it'll be too late. And while green growth promises us this can change, that we can continue this project of growth without increasing extraction and production, there is empirical evidence that we cannot. In an analysis of multiple green growth models, 2 economists have found that even in the best case scenario, the idea of green growth does not work. That's considering any prediction model, no matter how optimistic. In their paper, Hickel and Callas find that extant empirical evidence does not support the theory of green growth, or more precisely, that there is no evidence that we can have sustainability and growth at the same time, at least as we're first transitioning. All the economic, environmental models they look at only work when GDP growth approaches zero, or in other words, when growth is factored out of the equation. The problem is not that it's theoretically impossible to make our economy sustainable or founded on renewable energy. We can do all that and continue to live very fulfilling lives without needing our standards of living to drop. The problem is that it's not going to be profitable or quick enough by any metric, even the most optimistic of estimates. While it might be a successful model someday, green growth won't work in time. The problem is that while it's possible to transition to 100% renewable energy, we cannot do it fast enough to stay under 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius if we continue to grow the global economy at existing rates. Again, more growth means more energy demand, and more energy demand makes it all the more difficult, impossible in fact, to generate enough renewable capacity to meet it. We can't grow and transition to renewables fast enough to match that growth. It's already hard enough to have it meet our current demands, and the time frame isn't working in our favor, even when we're generous with our estimates. Then there's the fact that this approach isn't working as expected right now. Those ESG funds I mentioned earlier, the funds that offer green investment alternatives, they're not always profitable, and oftentimes less profitable than their fossil-dependent counterparts. If our goal is to wait for the market to make the best, most sustainable option also become the most profitable, we will be waiting a long time. Too long. But we don't need to get into the technical or scientific breakdowns of individual green growth models to see how this general approach is wrong. Even if we assume that Hickel and Callas's analysis is completely incorrect, and that the green growth models they criticize actually do get it right, and in time to prevent 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, there is a much greater obstacle in our way: power. The oil and gas industry is the most capitalized industry in the world. Simply put, that means that oil and gas is where the most money is. More money is concentrated in fossil fuels than in all of retail, or all of banking, or all of the tech sector. The total capitalization of the oil and gas industry is equivalent to $6.7 trillion. If we think of global capitalism as the arena where competition between industries happens, then this is a competition where fossil fuels have the best hand. Fossil fuels have the most money, and therefore the most power. In concrete terms, that means the oil and gas industry has the ability to prevent almost any sort of action that would hurt its interests. While we can theorize about green growth models and what happens if we transition to renewables at this or that rate, with this or that expected level of growth, the fossil fuel industry can prevent all of it from happening. It can sabotage like no other industry can. At the government level, fossil fuels have been lining the pockets of politicians for years, with prominent figures like Joe Manchin receiving millions of dollars from the coal industry to block the passage of even the most lukewarm anti-emission plans. In the media, fossil fuel companies have been discrediting climate change science for decades, with advertisements and fossil-friendly journalists obscuring the evidence or trying to spin attention away, like in this horrifying clip from this summer.
On a serious note, folks, by early next week, you could scrap 20 degrees, it could well be 40 degrees. I think there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of excess deaths early next week.
Yeah.
The charts that I can see in front of me are frightening. So we all like nice weather, but this will not be nice weather. This will be potentially lethal weather for a couple of days. It'll be brief, but it'll be brutal.
Oh,
So,
John,
you know,
but-
we can...
So, John, I want us to be happy about the weather, and every single. I don't know whether something's happened to meteorologists to make you all a little bit fatalistic and harbingers of doom. Because all of the broadcasts, particularly on the BBC, every time I've turned on anyone's talking about the weather, they're saying that there's going to be tons of fatalities. But haven't we always had hot weather?
More recently, fossil fuel companies have switched to presenting climate change as though it's a problem of individual consumption, like in a series of BP ads I covered in this video, rather than an economy-wide problem in the way we organize production. Fossil fuel companies have also worked for decades to bury renewable energy production and alternative ways to consume energy. They've tried to kill electric cars, an alternative that only ever offered a minuscule environmental benefit compared to gas-powered cars, but nonetheless threatens fossil fuels' commanding market share. Our entire social reproduction is happening under the ruling hand of fossil fuels. The way our society produces, consumes, and then justifies these practices in legal and cultural texts is heavily directed by fossil fuels and their interests. They decide what gets made, how it's advertised, how it's regulated, and at the end of the day, how we're meant to feel about it. Even if we could get all the green growth models to work in theory, if we could make our energy use optimally efficient, or even give up on the idea of growth entirely, our transition to a sustainable economy will not happen with fossil fuel interests standing in the way. So long as they are committed to being the most powerful player in the global economy, whether that's a growing economy or not, they will prevent change from happening. And what's terrifying is that their power will likely only grow over time as fossil fuels become more scarce and we are still trapped on their sinking ship. While we've been told that the coming scarcity of oil will push us into renewable energy sooner, scarcity is the name of the capitalist game. You can't make money when something's abundant. It's when it's scarce that the big bucks come in. The more our global oil reserves slowly dwindle, or the more we place restrictions on how much we allow to be extracted without directly controlling prices, the more valuable that oil becomes, and the more profits can be extracted from its sale. Look no further than what is happening right now. 2022 has been a year of record profits for oil and gas companies. To take a specific example, one French fossil fuel company, Total Energy, saw bigger earnings this year than any other company has in the entire history of the French economy. What all this means is that a small handful of people, led by the sole motivation to deliver greater profits than their competitors year after year, are making decisions that benefit their interests over those of the rest of humanity. They are fiercely clinging to their profits at the expense of our collective survival. The solution is obvious. We need an economic model that is democratic, that takes power away from the unaccountable few and returns it to the many. While many people tend to think of capitalism and democracy as synonyms, the case of what to do about climate change is a great example of why equating these two terms is misguided. Given the power to decide what to do about climate change, everyday people make vastly different decisions from corporations. As we've all seen, corporations choose profits and more extraction. But what about people? In a 2014 experiment, researchers at Harvard and Yale tasked people with the responsibility of managing collective resources among themselves and for future generations. The expectation was that if capitalism is a true reflection of democracy and the natural tendency of humans, this study group would essentially arrive at the same conclusion as our modern capitalist economy. They would deplete their resources and screw over future generations in favor of immediate profits. After all, we're often told that it's human nature to be greedy, or that when resources are not privately owned, they succumb to the so-called tragedy of the commons, Everybody acts selfishly to the point of exhausting common resources. Since each individual has more to gain by acting selfishly than by making sure the common good is preserved for everyone, the philosophical experiment always ends with people ruining it for each other and is used to justify splitting up common goods into private hands. But like many experiments before it, the Harvard and Yale study found that the opposite is true. Researchers found that, on average, a full 68% of individuals chose to use their share sustainably, taking only as much as the pool could regenerate, sacrificing possible profits so that future generations could thrive. In other words, the majority of people behave exactly the opposite of how economic theory predicts. More interestingly, when people were put in a democratic conversation about how to organize these resources as a group, since the overwhelming majority prioritized sustainability over profits, the group went forward with a strategy that would preserve their limited resources in perpetuity. They gave up profits. In other words, democracy works to combat climate change because when we're not broken up into little profit-maximizing machines, we make decisions that truly are better for everyone. And you don't have to trust this study by Harvard and Yale researchers if you don't want to. We've seen real-world examples of the same thing. Back in 2019, in response to the Yellow Vest protests, the French government gave everyday people a chance to exercise their democratic power. The government selected a group of 150 people completely randomly from all of France and tasked them with planning a 40% decrease in carbon emissions by 2030. Over the course of only 8 weekends, everyday people like you and me, not scientists, not academics, not politicians, people as young as 16 and as old as 80, more representative of the class, gender, and age makeup of the general population than the French Congress, all heard from experts, debated amongst themselves, and found ways to protect the environment. Not only that, they knew that after they were done, their propositions would be submitted to a national referendum, and if successful, would become actual law. It was a daunting task, and they weren't given very much time. But normal citizens stepped up and got to work. Like in the Harvard-Yale experiment, the Assembly chose sustainability. They proposed banning all advertisements for the most polluting products like cars or plane rides, banning single-use plastic by 2023, banning internal flights of less than 4 hours in favor of trains, ending planned obsolescence, making recycling mandatory for all plastic products, transitioning away from trucks as a means of transporting goods, making landlords renovate all buildings to be energy efficient by 2040, enforcing high taxes for polluting industries, and many, many more radical propositions in a list of about 150, which were noted in a publicly accessible 460-page document. So, what happened? Did France suddenly become a paradise of eco-utopianism? No. Within the first few sessions of the Assembly, its members realized that in order to achieve the kinds of measures that were necessary to prevent the most adverse climate change consequences, they would need to hurt industrial profits. It was clear that capitalism was not compatible with this project, but people were willing to compromise some profits and some production for continued survivability. They made difficult decisions knowing it would mean a chance to continue living on a planet suited for human needs. They recognized the need for radicality, and in many ways they embraced it. But of course this didn't go over well with the government. Immediately, the neoliberal French president and his ministers descended on the Assembly. In a series of speeches trying to divert the democratic process, France's politicians tried to get the Assembly to be reasonable and not get too many crazy ideas, telling them there's no such thing as, quote, magic money, and other such claims intended to pacify their radical ambitions. Still, the Assembly stayed the course and demanded change. But since messing with the Assembly wasn't enough, Macron opted for outright denial. The referendum that was meant to take place at the end of the 8 weeks never did. In fact, most of the policies proposed by the Assembly were either heavily watered down or, in a few instances, outright vetoed, as was the case for a proposed 4% tax on companies making more than 10 million euros to finance these projects. In stark contrast to the government's refusal, a national poll found that a majority of French people would have supported most measures. What this case shows is that people are ready for change, and they're ready to make difficult decisions. Capitalists aren't. What's it going to be? A brutal, dystopian, unlivable future for the majority of humanity, all so a few executives can keep their profits, or a brighter, fairer, sustainable future for us and for our children. A world where human flourishing matters more than the blood-soaked dollars in corporate bank accounts. Let's decide for ourselves, or we might lose the chance. I'm in.
Okay. So what do you think? Yep. Just a minute. Yep.
I think that clip was excellent, succinct in relaying what the problem is, probably better than the readings we've had. And plus we're looking at it as well, so we've got that visual cue. And it's sad, isn't it, to see that the ultimate greed of companies, big fossil fuel companies, is, I think, the biggest factor of where we're, coming to a climate societal crisis. Yes, and he's relaying how in France they tried to work from the bottom up. The people said, look, this is what we want, this is how we're going to do it, and it virtually came to nothing. So it gives you a sense of defeatism. What can we possibly do? Do we have to all rise up and march on Parliament and refuse to work? We're not doing anything, so that all of these big fossil fuel companies, their production goes down. Is that what we have to do? That sounds very extreme, doesn't it? I'm not sure what others think about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you.
And I mean, it's really difficult to kind of dissect it, I guess, because I think we're completely unaware in our daily life how reliant we are on everything to do with fossil fuels, from the clothes we wear, the food we eat, how we get around. Everything just comes back to that. So without even realising it, we're giving more and more power to the companies that are ultimately destroying us. And I think also, like, talking about the individualisation of people, you kind of see people aren't really willing to make drastic changes until it's directly affecting them and them, like, it's in their face. Whereas we can look at these disastrous videos and go, oh, horrible, and then continue on because it's not right here,
Okay, yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Yes?
I think that something that always sticks in my mind is that I live in Newcastle. I live in the place which is exporting so much coal to the rest of the world, and it feels very present on our doorstep, but the issues that that's causing also maybe are invisible to us. Like, maybe people that work in the port or in the mining industry in Newcastle, so we see that side, but we're not maybe seeing the effects of it. I think that video is awesome, but it obviously kind of weighs heavy on your heart. You sit here and you go, okay, awesome, I know all this information, but how am I supposed to take this and like work this into my everyday life? I try to be a conscious consumer, I try to do all these things, but they are invisible, no one sees them, and are they... I think when you said, does this require something that's extreme, it does require something that's extreme. The political election last year, like, we saw what we wanted, we saw who we elect. Yeah, it's like, can we do it? Like, we're trying to tell these people, this is what we want, we're electing these people to do this, and then they're in Parliament arguing about the little details about these things, and it's just like, super petty, and going back and forth, and they're changing different things, and the progress is just getting slower and slower, and it just feels like this thing that is obviously looming, and we do know that sitting in this class, and it's stressful. I feel stressed after watching that, basically.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No, it's all right. Like, obviously, I know all that, but yeah, it's stressful when you sit back down here.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Yep.
You might think this is funny coming from me, but I see the main problem is greed. Now, I've disclosed before, I'm an evangelical Christian, and I see that the greed is purely evil. But the problem is this: when people like myself try to do things and disclose that our foundation in life is God's word, the Bible, we are rubbished, we are trashed, we are bigoted, we are, what's the word? We get bigotry towards us. I can't think of the word this morning. And yet we try and try and try and try. And we are constantly bashed. And I'm sick of it. Most people I know that are millionaires, and I know quite a lot of millionaires, have worked jolly hard, and the last thing they want to do is pollute an environment or provide a product that is dangerous or whatever. Most of them have got that way through hard work and feeding their families. They are not the massive corporations. So maybe we all need a change of heart and work out what is the most important foundation in our lives. Some of you will say that's not God, that's your prerogative. But we need to start from and have that virtual heart surgery. And then I think at least people's attitudes will be very different.
Okay, thank you for sharing your view. Anyway. Anyone else? Yeah, okay, maybe, I don't know what to say myself, to be honest. I'm kind of speechless, but I think it gets to where, meaningful actions would emerge. But, I mean, the issue is the time frame. When, where, how. Have you heard of the boiling frog syndrome?
Yes.
Yeah, it's been like that so far, but the pain, I think, is being sensed more and more people. But there's a lot of distractions. When the IPCC reports came last year, it was the beginning of the Ukraine war. It completely distracted people from what the IPCC reports were saying. And again, we still have this conflict going on, the polarization of the world, us buying submarines and all these things, the conflicts with China. The geopolitics playing more, higher, distracting us. I mean, yes. I don't know what to say. I think the level of action from the grassroots level doesn't really match the level of the crisis. That's really sad. That's really sad. We have many. I think we're not short of ideas and alternatives, and I do believe that religion can play a significant role. I don't exclude that, because religion can motivate people if the religion is reinterpreted by the people for the people in a progressive way.
You need that faith, don't you? And
Faith is important. Sometimes it could be very spiritual. Sometimes it could be materialistic. But faith is important. And one of the problems with the left is being kind of ignorant about the role that religion can play. Whereas you look at the most successful social movements in the past, they drew on faith, like Martin Luther King. You just listen to his speeches, it's filled with lots of, motivations. But it's not the only way, of course. It's not the only way. Yeah.
And I think the big point is we need to wake up. We have to stop being placated by speeches like Kamala Harris. That said absolutely nothing. But we're going, oh, yeah, great. No, wake up.
Let's keep that conversation open in our minds, maybe in social media, among ourselves, at home. But, I mean, again, this could be a kind of a micro, I'm trying to repeat George Monbiot in my own way. Instead of saying micro-consumer is bullshit, it could be a micro-activist bullshit. But anyway, it's my belief that I think the day that passes that I don't talk and think about climate change and capitalism as the root cause is the total waste of day. I mean, that's the minimum I can do. And I know it's a micro-activist all, but it's still what I can do. It's what I can do. Anyway, let's move on. Sorry, guys, it's a very depressing, but maybe you find a little bit of optimism and power. Maybe when especially I think most of the people choose the topic for eco-centric alternatives, that can still be maybe intellectually, at least intellectually optimistic and helpful when we get to the business of writing the essay. And I have always begging you guys not to keep things that you learned through these classes just to yourself. Just spread the word. Just translate it. You're far more capable of translating these to the language of the ordinary people than a person like me who has become so corrupted by the sophisticated language of academia. I can't really sit and talk about these things, you know, in a meaningful way with the public. But you guys are fresh. You guys are on the ground, and certainly, I mean, I'm not going to excuse myself. I should also try. Anyway, so the questions, quiz questions. What is Monbiot's underlying message about addressing environmental issues when he discusses the issue of micro-consumerist bollocks and draws on the example of caddis flies? Anyone remembers the main message?
Distraction from the process?
Yes, yes, yeah. And then number 2, what political consequence does the idea of personal carbon footprint have according to George Monbiot? The political consequence. I think we discussed that. Anyone remembers? Yeah?
It shifts focus from the collective issues into like personal responsibility.
Yes, the conversion of citizens to consumers. That would be the political consequence. Number 3, what does the author suggest the motto of economic growth in capitalism, which also relates to the perception of capitalism as a pyramid scheme? What is the engine of economic growth now?
The disadvantages are more felt at the bottom of the pyramid, and the people with the wealth that are causing those disadvantages aren't experiencing them.
Yes, and he gives us 2 examples. One is geographical, you know, the plundering of Indian riches. The other one is temporal, you know, the kind of a temporal colonization of future generations. So the more we consume and the natural. So that would, I guess that would be related to the issue of the natural resources that we are plundering from future generations. Number 4, what is Monbiot's stance on the use of carbon tax as a solution to environmental crisis? I think we all remember that he was not favoring that, right? He was favoring wealth tax. Number 5, I highlighted that because you can't find the answer directly by looking into the reading, unfortunately, but it relates the 2 readings. You know, what would, you know, according to an eco-socialist like Hans Baer, what is the limitation of Monbiot's suggestion of implementing wealth taxes to prevent ecological catastrophe and pursue limitarianism? So what would a person like Hans Baer say to a person like George Monbiot? About the wealth tax as a solution? Let's see. Anyone remembers? Well, we know he's an eco-socialist, right? The second author. So I think the same criticism we had for, you may remember, Piketty. That the wealth tax is a good thing, but it's far from enough, right? It's far from being adequate. We need to address the system again. According to Baer, why are the solutions proposed under the guise of ecological modernization, green economy, and existing climate regimes insufficient to contain catastrophic climate change? Again, yes, it's the system. We need to address the system. It's a systemic issue. Number 7, what is one of the transitional reforms that could lead to a wider socio-ecological revolution, as suggested by Baer. Okay, towards the end, and I think you can skim through the first pages, because you see that most of the quiz questions are from the last few pages of the second one. So just to save your time, you don't need to really take note of everything in the first few pages. Mostly when he gets into the business of alternatives, that's where we pay more attention. And he comes up with two lists. One, I think, is a 6-item list, and the other one is a 14-item list. The 6-item list is related to the core goals of eco-socialism, and the 14 are transitional reformist things. So better not to confuse these two. So I'll give you 4 options, and then if this is about, for instance, the transitional reforms, make sure that the option that comes from the other list, the goals, is not going to be confused with this one. So choose the option that is related to the transitional reforms. Have a look at those 14 items that he has listed. I think they are interesting. Number 8, what does Baer mean by climate capitalism? He mentioned something from Naomi Klein, again one of the celebrities of the movement, and her idea of disaster capitalism. And then he says, by climate capitalism, I mean something that is related to disaster capitalism. That under climate capitalism, it tries to make more profit out of catastrophic climate change problems. So turning the crisis to the opportunity for more profit seeking. That's what he means. Now, number 9, again, is related to a deeper understanding of the text. Again, I tried to be kind of creating a conversation between Baer as an eco-socialist and neoliberals. So someone from neoliberal, someone influenced by neoliberals, may criticize Baer's argument by arguing that the focus on climate change mitigation and the transition to an eco-socialist world system should be left to the free market and individual consumer choices. They may also argue that the implementation of the reforms proposed by Baer would lead to an inefficient and ineffective economic system, and that the free market is the most efficient way to allocate resources and address environmental concerns. Additionally, they may argue that Baer's proposed reforms would be overly burdensome on businesses and would hinder economic growth and innovation. They would say, well, if you go for eco-socialism, if we adopt the reformist transitional reforms that Baer is suggesting, therefore we're going to see a decline in economic growth, everybody will go bankrupt, and the very first people who would oppose to that would be us, because we'll see our super funds shrinking and so on and so forth, losing our jobs and so on and so forth. The contradiction between cutting trees and cutting jobs, right? So how would a person like Baer respond to such criticisms? Yeah?
So he might argue that lower economic growth is necessary to address climate issues, and he may even argue that, as we saw in the video with the fossil fuel industry hindering electric cars, that neoliberal capitalism isn't it pushes itself as fueling innovation, but it quite often actively hinders it in order to protect their own interests.
Yes. Yeah, anyone else? How would you respond to this kind of criticism? That if we want to reform the system becomes dysfunctional and we will become the losers in that dysfunctional system.
Doesn't it kind of come down to that it's better to have more time and you could make more money if you have more time than less time, and like that idea. It's, if the world's around longer, then that's better than a short period of time and more growth. If that makes sense.
Okay, so you're responding to on behalf of Bev, or are you criticizing Bev?
No, like for more sustainable.
Okay.
Then it's more, then we're elongating the life of the planet. So
Yes.
if you're going to think of it in that terms, then
Oh yes, okay, yes,
Yes.
yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so his response is that, yeah, we may sacrifice growth, but in long term, it will be much more beneficial because we're surviving. Yes,
Yeah.
that's a very good point. Thank you. Sorry for
I
I failed to grab. Yeah, that's okay. Okay, anyone else wants to respond on behalf of her? Helping him. Maybe we can say, well, if the market solutions were really the solutions, we were not in this mess. So let's look at the history and learn something from the history. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think the options that we have for that question covers what we just discussed. Okay.
I think an eco-socialist might also argue that the free market looks more efficient and effective as an economic system than it actually is, because it only focuses on capital and wealth. If you were to take in sort of like the using the environmental resources quicker than they regenerate, that's an inefficiency that system doesn't factor into itself. So it looks more efficient because it's using a measure that's favourable to itself.
Yes, yes, okay. And if the system works for some of us, that doesn't mean that it works for everyone else. And if we place ourselves in the place of those people who are the losers, we see that billions of people are already losers, and we are worried about us losing. Okay.
I was just going to say about the thing with resources and that, and not focusing on the effects of the environment, and that it makes it it shows that how much capitalism isn't a natural system, or it hasn't been around forever. Like if you go through history and look at it now, how it affects us in like constantly needing to, we call it, dig up resources and all that, like dig up the earth to support us. It makes you realise that none of this is natural and forever.
Yeah. Again, it relates to that issue of long term, yes. Okay.
I think in the first article, it talks about how if the weather changes, non-humans, animals, living species will adapt and grow and change. But us as humans, we've almost destroyed our landscape or our environment that we thought that we had control over. We haven't adapted, so we think we're the top species and in control, but really all of these other species are working with the environment and have made sense of the environment to work with it, but we've decided not to do that, and we are now trying to backtrack with the Green New Deal and things like this, and I don't know, I think we put ourselves too above the earth that now we've got to, just live back down, be more of a collective with the earth, because otherwise
Okay. What's the time? I think my watch is
2 minutes. You've got 2 minutes.
Oh, I have 2 minutes. Okay. Should I stop it? I had a few other slides, which is, again, I would like to invite you to have a look, especially the notes below. This is, I will discuss that next week, don't worry. This is something that I try to frame our approach, our discussions for the rest of the semester, which is based on this idea that our life domain or social life, we can artificially, intellectually divide it between the economy, politics, community, and the web of life, if you like, as we normally do. And any reform in any sector, in any section, requires reforms in other sections. And I call this a communist framework that requires us to think more in a systemic way and more comprehensive. For instance, when I talk about ecologizing the economy, you can think of the Green New Deal, like as a way of greening the economy, ecologizing the economy, right? But why we haven't actually been able to push for Green New Deal because of the obstacles in the politics, because the democracy is dysfunctional, because the politics is not democratic enough. So we need to democratize our politics further, more radically. We need to also ecologize our politics. We need to equalize it so we will see more voices from the minorities being heard through the politics. And community, we normally think community is a great place, but community can be the place of a lot of injustices, discrimination, gender discrimination, racial discrimination. We need to also democratize our communities. We need to ecologize, make them greener, equalize them, and so on and so forth. So you see that because these sections, these 4 sections, are so intertwined. Any reform in each section requires reforms in other sections. This doesn't mean that every person, every activist, everyone involved in change should be an expert in all those aspects of life. But it requires them to listen to each other and to get connected to each other. So one of the projects that my team and I have been pursuing through a number of years, more recently, is to map the movements, to map the initiatives. Can't believe how many